Hey, ladies and gentlemen, this is Mr. Guy. Obviously, I'm not here today, so I decided to make a video so we can kind of keep moving through our content here. If you're confused by anything we talk about today, this is all in section 8.6 in your book. That's page 552. But this video is going to be pretty straightforward, kind of running you through what we're looking at. This chapter that we're going to talk about or this section, is all about kind of identifying quadrilaterals, and even more so than it's kind of like classifying them. How do they fit together? What special things does each kind of quadrilateral has? How do they relate to each other? Okay, so that's kind of our big goal here. The first big section you should see on your chart, we are going to fill in with just a generic word for quadrilaterals. Okay, so again, do not judge me for my writing with this. This is not the best tool in the world. You'll see probably later that it likes to jump around and not work correctly, so we may see that during this video as well. My handwriting is not the prettiest on the computer, again, because it kind of jumps on me and stuff. So this says quadrilateral, and there's a little extra something there. I was trying to erase that, but okay, but this is a quadrilateral, so that's what's going to go in this first section here. This is just going to be our generic, everything that we talk about counts as a quadrilateral. So we could draw a picture of a square in here if we wanted to. We could draw a rhombus. We could draw a trapezoid, maybe a kite. There's just a lot of different, all the things that we talk about fit under a quadrilateral. That's our most generic thing that we have. Now, the next thing we're going to split into is three large categories, which looks like my box over here kind of disappeared, so we'll draw that in there. But three kind of big categories of these quadrilaterals we can kind of start dissecting them into. The first and the biggest one that we talked about are parallelograms. Okay, as I like to say, parallelograms. All right, so parallelograms are all of those four-sided figures that we looked at that had two sets of parallel sides. So all the different kinds of parallelograms we've talked about rhombuses, we've talked about rectangles, we've talked about squares. Okay, there's a lot of different kinds of parallelograms that we've talked about. We've going to have things that aren't any of those, where they have longer sides and they're not 90 degrees, but they still have parallel sides. So that's parallelograms. Underneath parallelograms, we can split that even more. We can split it into our two main categories of parallelograms that we've talked about, which is a rhombus, which we know that rhombuses have all the same sides. So our rhombus we can draw, it means that all four of our sides are congruent. The other one that we kind of split into was a rectangle. Now, rectangles, we don't care about the sides. Okay, get rectangle doesn't care about any of the sides. What it does care about is that your angles are all 90 degrees. Once again, please do not judge me on my writing here. Okay, so the one thing it does care about is that all your angles are 90 degrees. Obviously, your rectangle is probably much prettier than mine if you're taking your notes. Okay, but we should have parallelograms. Our big things are a rhombus and a rectangle. And then down here, both of those, obviously, if something is both of those, it is a square. A square is both a rhombus and a rectangle. Just to give you a little bit of an idea of how this graphic organizer is supposed to help you is kind of to keep track of how things kind of nestle in each other. It's almost like Russian nesting dolls, where you can say like, oh, if this is this and it's also this, it's also this. So if I have a square, which all four sides are congruent, and I have four 90-degree angles, that is also a rectangle and a rhombus. Rectangles or rhombuses are parallelograms, which in turn are quadrilaterals. Okay, so it kind of gives us a little bit of a flow of how we can work through these things. The next one over, if you look at the next category, that one's going to be our trapezoids. This is the last one that we talked about yesterday a little bit, was trapezoids. It's so hard to write these words. Okay, and the trapezoids are, when they only have two sides that are parallel. Okay, so only two sides can be parallel in a trapezoid. And the special kind of trapezoid we talked about yesterday was the isosceles trapezoid. Now, I'm just going to write I trapezoid because, again, my handwriting's awful. You probably want to go ahead and write isosceles down. That way you remember what the I stands for. I'm just going to write I trap. I trapped you here to watch this video. Oops. Okay, but isosceles trapezoid, and that is where you have two of those sides being congruent, just like an isosceles triangle, which also means that these two angles are congruent as well. Okay, so isosceles trapezoid. The last one over here is a kite. And this is what we talked very briefly about yesterday, but there's not tons to talk about it. A kite is a couple of those cool properties where your diagonals, they form 90-degree angles with each other, and then these angles are congruent, but not these two. At least we don't know if they are or not. Okay, so that's what makes us a kite. Okay, so here are your different quadrilaterals. So you can see under the category quadrilateral, we can either have a parallelogram, a trapezoid, or a kite. And then these things kind of move down into other things that go with them. Now, if you go ahead and look at the back of your paper, there's a couple questions that we're going to kind of go over together. Okay, and I'm a little zoomed in here. Let me zoom out so we can kind of see the question a little bit better. Okay, the first question is I say, hey, if I have a quadrilateral that has at least one pair of opposite congruent angles, what could that quadrilateral be? Okay, so if I have a quadrilateral with at least one pair of opposite congruent angles, what kind of quadrilateral could that be? I'm going to add a little text box here so I can type to you. It might be a little bit better. Okay, so we want to think about all the different quadrilaterals that have one pair of opposite congruent angles. Well, the first one that I can think of is that it could be a parallelogram. Parallelograms definitely have a pair of opposite congruent angles. We can go back and look at our chart here. These definitely have opposite congruent angles, which also means it could be a rhombus, a rectangle, or a square, because everything that's a parallelogram fits into one of those categories. So when I say parallelogram, I'm going to include that could mean it's a rhombus, could mean it's a rectangle, or it could mean that it's a square. Okay, all of those have opposite angles that are congruent. When I look here as well, I also identify the kite. The kite has opposite angles that are congruent, so it definitely could also be a kite. So I'll go ahead and add kite as one of the quadrilaterals that this could be. Now, when I go ahead and look back here, we've already kind of covered this whole category. We've covered this category. The only one that's left is the trapezoids. And what I'm going to notice is that trapezoids do not have opposite angles that are congruent. So that means that this quadrilateral would either have to be a parallelogram, one of those three that we talked about, or a kite. So that's kind of some of the reasoning you have to do in this chapter is kind of look at, oh, what are they giving me? What categories they kind of fit into? How can I go ahead and do that? The second example here is asking about, is there enough information to show that this is an isosceles trapezoid? So if you look, this trapezoid has an angle of 106, and it's got two angles of 74, and I want to know if there's enough information to show it's an isosceles trapezoid. In order to show a trapezoid, you have to show that two sides are parallel, but not the other two sides, okay? Now, when I go ahead and I take a look at this, I can see when I look at this trapezoid, I can kind of see that these two angles right here are supplementary. Okay, so 106, 74, that means these are supplementary. They add up to 180. That means that these two angles over here are also supplementary. They're going to add up to 180. However, because these angles are not opposite each other, the angles that are congruent, it's the angles that are next to each other congruent. I know right away that this is not a parallelogram. Parallelogram, the opposite angles would have to be congruent, and that's not true in this shape. So because it's a quadrilateral and it's not a parallelogram, that means right there that it has to fit into the trapezoid category. These two sides are going to be parallel, these two are not. In addition to that, I can also see that these bottom two angles are congruent. They're both 74 degrees. That's one of our determining factors for whether it's isosceles or not. So for this one, I can say without a doubt that yes, this is an isosceles trapezoid because the only category it fits into is a trapezoid, and then because I have these two congruent angles, I also have a isosceles trapezoid. So that's what you guys should have gotten out of this chapter. That's kind of what we're looking for here is sort of this flow chart to help us identify different things. The sub should have listed for you what homework you have to do or what problems you have to do. There's going to be a lot of those sort of identifying. In fact, the first problem you have to do, please make sure you take your time on that. It's a almost like a chart you have to fill out where you kind of fill in different information about each of the each of the quadrilaterals. It's really important that you're able to identify the difference between each of these quadrilaterals. Okay, what makes something a rhombus versus a square versus a trapezoid versus a kite, and you have to be able to identify those differences. Otherwise, these problems are going to be really hard for you. Thank you guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed a Mr. Guy digital exclusive. Hopefully you didn't have Fortnite up in the corner of your iPad the whole time while you're watching this. I know who would do that. Probably Carson. All right. Have a good one.